Really cool. Just the fact that there's a reference frame argument like that, a relative reference frame argument. They're talking about what they saw. Here comes land. It looks like the land is moving. Of course, they knew the land wasn't moving. Everyone
Yep.
knows that, but you just describe it that way because that's the way we talk.
Dr. Carter's argument cuts both ways. If he is going to use the reference frame argument to justify that the Earth rotates under a fixed sun, the same reference frame argument can be used against Dr. Carter's position, since modern relativistic science has already agreed that it is only a matter of a coordinate transformation that will allow someone to claim the Earth rotates under a fixed sun, or that the sun revolves around a fixed Earth. Neither position can be proven or falsified from a reference frame point of view. So the appeal to relative motion only weakens Dr. Carter's argument, not bring him any closer to his desire to exonerate heliocentrism as the correct model. This brings us back to a previous point that Dr. Carter made when he claimed that the heliocentric reference frame is not really heliocentric, rather, in his words, it is a, quote, gravitationally balanced system, unquote. What Dr. Carter is referring to is the Newtonian system, the one he prefers. Consequently, he will only argue from the perspective of reference frames when he is dealing with phenomenological language in the Bible, for example, the sun rising or setting, or the boat and land of Acts 27. As such, he consistently avoids dealing with the dynamic forces in alternative reference frames, especially those laid out in Einstein's general relativity. Perhaps the reason why he avoids these alternatives is that he knows Einstein's general relativity supports a geocentric system. To demonstrate this, we will need do a short analysis of the Newtonian system and show how even Dr. Carter's preferred model comes up short in dealing with the actual reality. First, one must understand that the Newtonian system is built on a non-relativistic or absolute reference frame, and second, the operation of that system is confined to our solar system. This is opposed to the general relativistic system that is built on a relative frame that is not absolute, that is, it can move, bend, or change, and can include the whole universe. In the Newtonian system, for a moving planet to travel in a straight line by its own inertia, and at the same time be pulled in by the gravity of the Sun so that the planet would then divert to a curved path around the Sun, it is required that the space in which the planet moves must be absolutely fixed. If the space moved, then it could not be said that the planet was seeking to move in a straight line. In other words, in order to have the straight lines of Newtonian motion, space cannot move or bend. 200 years later, Ernest Mach explained to the physics world that Newton did not have the right to assert that space or the universe is absolute, since in making such an assertion it means that Newton imported a foreign metaphysical element into his system, which is not permitted in empirical science. As philosopher and scientist Bertrand Russell put it, quote, "Whether the earth rotates once a day from west to east, as Copernicus taught, or the heavens revolve once a day from east to west, as his predecessors believed, the observable phenomena will be exactly the same. This shows a defect in Newtonian dynamics, since an empirical science ought not to contain a metaphysical assumption, which can never be proved or disproved by observation. And no observations can distinguish the rotation of the earth from the revolutions of the heavens." Unquote. Taken from Dennis Sciama's The Unity of the Universe, 1961, pages 102 and 103. This defect came about when Newton decided to use dynamic force laws, as opposed to the mere geometry that Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler used, to demonstrate how the solar system operated. The defect in Newton's system manifested itself because when he applied his famous equation, F equals ma, to the operation of the solar system, he found that he had to add foreign forces into his equation to make it work in circular moving or accelerated frames, such as when the planets go around the Sun. As Wikipedia describes this matter, these additional forces are termed inertial forces, fictitious forces or pseudo-forces. By accounting for the rotation by addition of these fictitious forces, Newton's laws of motion can be applied to a rotating system as though it was an inertial system. They are correction factors which are not required in a non-rotating system. In other words, Newton's system, the very system that claims to have solved the question left over by Kepler of how a planet can revolve around the Sun, in reality, Newton cannot answer the question unless he incorporates additional forces that are not part of its mechanical system. As such, Newton's mechanics fails to tell us how the solar system operates, but it has covered up this problem by calling the additional forces, quote, fictitious or pseudo-forces, unquote, as if they just appear all by themselves and have no concrete source. In the geocentric model, there is no such problem. By going beyond Newton, that is, first, by including the universe outside our solar system, and second, by allowing the same universe to move and not be absolute, geocentrism finds that the so-called fictitious forces of Newton's system are actually real forces that originate from the angular momentum of a rotating universe, and we identify them as the centrifugal, Coriolis, and Euler forces. Einstein realized the same thing, and he added that because Newton could not see this truth concerning the real origin of the additional forces, then Newton's system, Einstein said, had defects. As Einstein put it, quote, "One need not view the existence of centrifugal forces as originating from the motion of K', the Earth. One could just as well account for them as resulting from the average rotational effect of distant detectable masses, the stars and galaxies, as evidenced in the vicinity of K', the Earth, whereby K', the Earth, is treated as being at rest. If Newtonian mechanics disallows such a view, then this could very well be the foundation for the defects of that theory." Unquote. Taken from Hans Thiering's paper, On the Effect of Rotating Distant Masses in Einstein's Theory of Gravitation, 1918. In other words, Newton's system must consider the appearance of centrifugal force, that is, the outward force a planet would feel as it revolved around the Sun, not as a real force but as a fictitious force, that is, fictitious in the sense that the force felt by the planet is only the result of curved motion around the Sun, but it cannot be a real force. But Einstein said, not necessarily so. Einstein said that a centrifugal force will be felt if the universe of stars revolves around an Earth at rest. The important distinction, Einstein added, is that the centrifugal force experienced when the universe of stars rotates around a fixed Earth will be a real force, not a fictitious one. That is, the centrifugal force is not felt because the planet changes direction, but because there are real centrifugal forces created by the angular momentum of a rotating universe that impose themselves on all celestial bodies. It is because Newton did not discover this truth that Einstein said his system had defects. We should add, however, that in a recent discovery of the last page of Newton's famous work, the Principia, Newton admits that if he included forces from the rest of the universe, then it was possible to have a geocentric system. Nobel laureate, Steven Weinberg, discovered this addition to Newton's Principia, and he describes it in his 2015 book, To Explain the World. Quote, "If we were to adopt a frame of reference like Tycho's in which the Earth is at rest, then the distant galaxies would seem to be executing circular turns once a year, and in general relativity this enormous motion would create forces akin to gravitation, which would act on the Sun and planets and give them the motions of the Tychonic theory." Newton seems to have had a hint of this. In an unpublished Proposition 43 that did not make it into the Principia, Newton acknowledges that Tycho's theory could be true if some other force besides ordinary gravitation acted on the Sun and planets. Unquote. Here are Newton's exact words from Proposition 43 as translated from the Latin of his Principia Mathematica. Quote, "In order for the Earth to be at rest in the center of the system of the Sun, planets and comets, there is required both universal gravity and another force in addition that acts on all bodies equally according to the quantity of matter in each of them, and is equal and opposite to the accelerative gravity with which the Earth tends to the Sun. 4. Such a force, acting on all bodies equally and along parallel lines, does not change their position among themselves, and permits bodies to move among themselves through the force of universal gravity in the same way as if it were not acting on them. Since this force is equal and opposite to its gravity toward the Sun, the Earth can truly remain in equilibrium between these two forces and be at rest. And thus celestial bodies can move around the Earth at rest, as in the Tychonic system." Unquote. Taken from George E. Smith's essay titled, Newtonian Relativity, a Neglected Manuscript, an Understressed Corollary, published, 2015. In the end, it is easy to see that once we expand Newton's limited world of the Sun and its planets to the universe itself, even the staunchest Copernican of his day can suddenly become a geocentrist.
Way we talk. Okay, but doesn't the Bible also say things like the earth shall not be moved?
And
if
it also,
the earth shall not be moved, that
Mhm.
means the earth doesn't move, right?
Well, except of course you got the righteous shall not be moved. Same Hebrew word, Psalm 121. So righteous shall not be moved. The psalmist also says, "I shall not be moved." Does that mean he's in a straitjacket? It's not talking about that, is it?
Although this kind of argument is commonly used to get around the Bible's geocentric passages, it is presumptuous, superficial, and unscholarly, and in any case it doesn't prove the earth is rotating or revolving. It only proves that a Hebrew word can be used both figuratively and literally, but this is true of almost all Hebrew and Greek words. Of course, this has always been the problem in biblical hermeneutics. When can we interpret figuratively and when do we interpret literally? But here is where Dr. Carter and Dr. Sarfati merely paint themselves into a corner. When in their studies on creationism, Carter and Sarfati read Genesis 1, or Psalm 104, or many of the dozens of passages in the Bible that speak about creation, they invariably use a literal interpretation. Indeed, they chide their opponents whenever they deny a literal interpretation and insist on putting only a figurative or symbolic interpretations on Genesis 1. As it stands, Dr. Carter and Dr. Sarfati come to their chosen texts of Scripture concerning creation with a conviction that they must be interpreted literally. Where does that conviction come from and how can they defend it? They do so from an inner resolve that God, who inspired it, meant it literally. So be it. The geocentrist, for thousands of years, has believed the same conviction about all the geocentric passages in the Bible. Dr. Carter and Dr. Sarfati might also claim that their literal interpretation of Genesis 1 is based on their firm knowledge of science. So be it. But when the geocentrist says that biblical passages that say, quote, "Earth shall not be moved," unquote, or the passage in Joshua 10 that says the sun and moon were stopped in the sky for a whole day should be taken literally because modern science has shown the equal possibility that the earth can be fixed and that the sun and stars revolve around it, Carter and Sarfati protest quite vociferously. At the same time, ironically, they appeal to Acts 27 to prove that even the Bible uses reference frames. So if there are relative reference frames, then how can their heliocentrism be proven as fact and geocentrism denied? Obviously, it can't. Hence this shows that either the science of Carter and Sarfati is inadequate, or they simply refuse to extend the courtesy of relative reference frames to their ideological opponents. Carter and Sarfati may then appeal, as they have done in other venues, what they believe are specific empirical evidences that the Earth is rotating and moving around the Sun, such as stellar parallax, stellar aberration, Doppler shift, the Foucault pendulum, the bulge of the Earth, etc., but this only reveals their ignorance of the current science. In the last 100 years or so, every single experiment that has been propped up as proof of heliocentrism has been shown to be no proof at all by the advances of science. This happened, as we noted earlier, when relativity replaced Newtonian mechanics in the late 1800s. More on that later. As for their appeal to Psalm 121 verse 3, yes, it is used figuratively there in reference to a person who resists temptation. But the figurative usage in Psalm 121 does not mean it has to be used figuratively in Psalm 93, verses 1 and 2, or in 1 Chronicles 16 verse 30. This is a fundamental rule in biblical exegesis that they have ignored. Let's look more closely. The word in question is the Hebrew mart, which is the word for move. It appears 39 times in the Old Testament, 20 of which are in the Psalms. The Hebrew kal form appears 13 times, the nifil 23 times, and 1 each in the hafil and hithpale. The Hebrew word mart can refer to things as simple as a slipping of the foot, as in Deuteronomy 32 verse 5, Psalm 17 verse 5, and Psalm 38 verses 16 and 17. And it can also refer to moving the earth internally as in an earthquake, as seen in Psalm 82 verse 5, and Isaiah 24 verse 19. Of all the words in Hebrew referring to movement, mart is used when any, even the slightest movement, is in view. Hence, it can refer to a shaking or vibration as well as a change of location. Mart, in the physical or literal sense, refers to the transition from a state of rest to a state of movement. In the figurative sense, it can be used to refer to moving from one state to another, as, for example, in moving from a state of stability to a state of instability, or vice versa. The point that is not to be missed is that mart always has a literal meaning, since it means to move. The literal meaning can then be used in a figurative sense but only if the context allows. In other words, the basic meaning is literal, a possible secondary meaning could be figurative, as is the case with all Hebrew and Greek nouns. More on this later.
Take scripture in its context. You have to look at the grammar, you have to look at the genre, you have to look at the surrounding phraseology. If you take it out of context, the Bible can say an awful lot of things that aren't true, like, God is an all-consuming fire, or as Zerubbabel will be like a signet on God's right hand, and all sorts of things like that. You can derive a lot of really fallacious theology from, so we have to be careful. And here, clearly, the earth shall not be moved is not a reference to a fixed earth. Just like the psalmist shall not be moved, the righteous shall not.
Carter's requirements for correct biblical interpretation only beg the question. Did he use any of the 5 requirements he listed for correct interpretation on the very passages in question, namely, Psalm 93 or 1 Chronicles 16, before he concluded that those passages are not teaching the earth is fixed? No. He didn't even read the context of the passages, much less examine them. Carter merely transferred the figurative interpretation he had put on Psalm 121 and superimposed it onto Psalm 93 and 1 Chronicles 16 without once examining the context, the grammar, the genre, or the surrounding phraseology of those 2 passages, or any other geocentric passage. Yet he was insistent that Psalm 93 was, quote, clearly, not a reference to a fixed earth, unquote. Perhaps if Dr. Carter actually looked at the context of these passages, as we did in Joshua 10, he might see things differently. So let's look at the context of these passages to see what they offer. Psalm 93, verses 1 and 2, says, "The Lord reigns, he is robed in majesty, the Lord is robed, he is girded with strength. Yea, the world is established, it shall never be moved. To thy throne is established from of old, thou art from everlasting." 1 Chronicles 16 verses 30 to 31 says, "Tremble before him, all the earth, he has made the world firm, not to be moved. Let the heavens be glad and the earth rejoice, let them say among the nations, the Lord is King." Now, let's look at the context. It tells us that Psalm 93 and 1 Chronicles 16 are portraying the Lord's majesty and strength, as a king who wears his royal robes, signifies that he reigns supreme over all the land and has subdued all his enemies. For the psalmist, one specific display of the Lord's power is that he has established the world so that it cannot move. So, like the throne of a king that does not move unless by his order, so God has set the world and will not be moved. In other words, the psalmist is using the non-movability of one to demonstrate the non-movability of the other. Obviously, in order for the earth to be an example of God's immovability or immutability, the earth must also be unmovable. If the earth moved, then analogously God would move and be mutable. As the comparison between the immutability of God and the immovability of the world is quite evident in the passage, the meaning of the phrase, establishes the world, is even more evident. For example, if one were to attempt to put a figurative meaning on the phrase the world is established, it would be rather difficult, since the political, military, or cultural movements of the nations shift quite frequently and thus would not serve as a good comparison to God's strength and stability. Hence, the phrase, establishes the world, can only refer to the physical earth, not something figurative. Hence the best way the psalmist's analogy can have its intended effect is if an object exists that is unmoved in the midst of all other objects that are moving. If the psalmist is referring to an unmoving earth, then the imagery displayed by Psalm 93 is very accurate, for the earth would be the only body at rest in the midst of a sea of moving bodies in the heavens that are always changing position. The earth would be the only foundation point, the only immovable object, and thus the best example to picture the immutability of God himself. More to the point is that Psalm 93 verse 2 adds that God's throne is established. Logically, for the analogy to work, since his throne is established and thus does not move, then the world cannot move. The intended imagery is identical to the passages that call the earth the Lord's footstool, since footstools are understood to be aligned with the unmoving throne, not moving around it. In all such biblical passages the notion of rest for the Lord's footstool is emphasized, as in Isaiah 66 verse 1, which says, "Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool, what is the house which you would build for me, and what is the place of my rest?" 1 Chronicles 28 verse 2 says, "I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and for the footstool of our God." Psalm 132 verses 7 and 8 say, "Let us go to his dwelling place, let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and go to thy resting place, thou and the ark of thy might." To have rest from movement means the earth is motionless, which is appropriate in the earth's case only if it is not moving through space.
Psalmist shall not be moved. The righteous shall not be moved. It's different. It shall not tremble, shall not quake, shall not be in fear, depending on the context of that word.
Because of the specific definition of the Hebrew word, mart, that is, to refer to the slightest movement, some might argue that the phrase, shall never be moved, could also be translated as, shall never be shaken. If that is the case, then perhaps one could also argue that a shaking of the world could have some political or personal overtones rather than refer to a non-moving earth. But, as noted earlier, the political systems of the world are inherently unstable and the personal plights of human beings are that they often fall from grace, and thus neither image would make a good comparison to display the stability and strength of the throne of God. More importantly, if the proper translation were only, shall not be shaken, rather than also, shall not be moved, this would only enhance the imagery of an immobile earth, for then the phrase, shall not be shaken, would require that the earth be so firm in its position that it would not only be prohibited from rotating or revolving, but it would also be prohibited from shaking internally. Consequently, we can see why the Hebrew word mart was chosen, since it refers to the earth's resistance to even the slightest external movement. If vibration occurs, it will occur within the internal structure of the earth but not with respect to the earth's position in space, where it remains unmoved, in accordance with the definition of the Hebrew word mart. In other words, because of the specific definition of the Hebrew word mart, it means the earth will not move even an inch from its place in space. In fact, in the geocentric system, the reason earthquakes occur is that the internal movements within the earth are rubbing against the external forces that are keeping the earth immobile in space. The result is an upheaval of the land surface. Thus it is not surprising to know that over 1 million earthquakes happen all over the earth every year. The only other detail in Psalm 93 regards the meaning and usage of the word, world. As it stands, the Hebrew consistently uses the term in reference to the earth, not the universe at large. The Hebrew word for world here is tebel, which appears 38 times in the Old Testament. In non-poetical contexts, tebel sometimes has a larger focus than the physical world and may include the more abstract notions associated with existence, such as the totality of human consciousness, as used in Isaiah 24 verse 4 or Isaiah 26 verse 9. But most frequently, the Hebrew tebel is used as a synonym of the Hebrew word, erects, a word that refers to the earth, as used in 1 Samuel 2 verse 8, Psalm 77 verse 18, Psalm 90 verse 2, and Isaiah 34 verse 1. And in the passages that tebel is used without erects, tebel always refers to the earth, or that place which is inhabited by mankind, such as 2 Samuel 22 verse 16, Isaiah 13 verse 11, 14 verse 17, and 18 verse 3. Most importantly, tebel never refers to the universe at large. Hence, according to the definitions of all these Hebrew words, it is the earth alone that is kept immobile, not the universe. In the geocentric system, the universe rotates around the earth once per day.
So, since the Bible really doesn't say one way or another, in fact, if anything, the Bible says we are flexible about what reference frame we can use, though the very fact that in Acts 27:27 uses a different frame from Earth is a precedent for our choosing the best reference frame for what we need.
First, we already saw that Acts 27 is not using two different reference frames as much as it is saying that the appearance of the land coming toward the boat was an illusion caused by the fact that the incident takes place at night. If it took place during daylight, there would be no reason to say that the land was coming toward the boat. Moreover, to qualify as a relative reference frame, not just a reference frame, both objects, the land and the boat, must have the possibility of moving, which is not the case in Acts 27. Since Sarfati himself has agreed that the sailors in the boat already know that the land cannot move toward them, then they also know that the illusion of seeing the land move toward them must be scientifically wrong. Hence they know that one of the reference frames is always true and the other is always false. But in relativity, to the observer, either one can be true and the other false. Second, Sarfati's claim that the Bible doesn't care which reference frame we use is simply untrue. If the scientifically objective passages of the Bible, such as Joshua 10, must have a geocentric model in order to allow the story to comport with scientific facts about the motions of the sun and moon, then obviously the Bible certainly does care which reference frame is used. But let's accept, for the sake of argument, Sarfati's claim that the Bible doesn't care. As such, Sarfati is merely revealing the underlying presupposition to his analysis. That is, he chooses a heliocentric reference frame simply because he wants or needs it for the Christian apologetic with which he has sided. At the same time, he disdains and discards the geocentric frame. But since either reference frame can be true, on what basis can Sarfati choose the reference frame he likes, the heliocentric one, yet he knows the geocentric frame is just as viable and worthy to be chosen? In short, he has no basis. Just because, in his estimation, the Bible sometimes uses various frames of reference in its description of nature does not mean Sarfati can side with the one he likes best and discard the other. If he isn't doing so, then there is another basis upon which Sarfati is choosing the heliocentric frame that has nothing to do with reference frames in themselves. So far, neither Carter nor Sarfati have given us their alternate basis for making their choice. Curious minds want to know.
So, we don't have a giant theological conundrum. We do have a lot of philosophical, early scientific arguing. Let's go through the process here.
Mm-hmm.
Back in, way back in time, ancient Greek, ancient Roman, biblical era, we have Ptolemy.
Yeah.
And we have other people, and they're saying that the Earth is a center. And then they're looking at stars, and they're watching stars and planets, but planets do weird things, because like Mars will go forward and go backwards and go forward again. So they have a simple idea. Everything goes around the Earth. And then they make an observation that doesn't fit. What do?
Well, they make what's called an epicycle, don't they? Because you've got a circle, but epicycles are circle upon a circle. And they say the planet's actually riding this epicycle, and as the circle turns, it sometimes moves backwards. You see, that's why we see retrograde motion, the backward motion of planets from time to time, goes on this epicycle.
Can that be predicted from the basic theory?
It seems to be based, we find here's a weird motion, let's add another epicycle to explain this motion. It doesn't predict anything. All we can do is tweak it to fit the observation. It won't predict anything new, though.
Yes. And if you look at the moon doesn't always go through the sky at the same rate. The moon's orbit is not always as circular. Sometimes it's more elliptical. Sometimes the moon is closer, sometimes it's further away. Sometimes the orbit is rounder. And sometimes you can see not just the face of the moon, but you can see around one side or the other based on how fast it's spinning. So each one of those things, they had to come up with an ad hoc, that's because of another epicycle. Oh, that's because of another epicycle on an epicycle. And they just kept adding and adding and adding more terms. And none of those things are predicted from the basic idea. They're accessory things that are added after the fact to try to keep the theory alive.
This claim is another one of those just-so stories. In reality, one of the more obvious faults of Copernicus's De Revolutionibus was that for all its complaints against epicycles, in the end Copernicus actually produced more epicycles than Ptolemy. Ptolemy's system has 40 epicycles, whereas Copernicus ends up with 48. Yet in his earlier work from 1510, the Commentriolus, Copernicus stated that his heliocentric system needed only 34 epicycles, and even that numeration was off by 4. As historian Arthur Kestler notes, Copernicus discovered that when the time came to work out the finer details of his system a couple of decades later, he was forced to add 14 more epicycles just to make his version of celestial mechanics come close to the accuracy of Ptolemy's. For example, books 4 and 5 of De Revolutionibus are filled with page after page of epicycles. More disturbing is the fact that, to make Ptolemy's model appear worse than it really was, Copernicus exaggerated the number of epicycles employed by Ptolemy. Although Ptolemy used only 40 epicycles, Copernicus asserted that he had 80. In fact, historian Robert Poulter coined the phrase, quote, the 80-34 syndrome, unquote, against those who desired to place Copernicus above Ptolemy. The great historian, Owen Gingerich, adds that the myth of having to put up with Ptolemaic epicycles perpetuated itself like an out-of-control gossip chain. He writes, quote, the legend reached its apotheosis when the 1969 Encyclopaedia Britannica announced that, by the time of King Alfonso, each planet itself required 40 to 60 epicycles. Unquote. The Britannica article concluded, quote, after surviving more than a millennium, the Ptolemaic system failed, its geometrical clockwork had become unbelievably cumbersome, and without satisfactory improvements in its effectiveness. Unquote. Not taking this discrepancy lightly, Gingrich retorts, quote, when I challenged them, the Britannica editors replied, lamely, that the author of the Britannica article was no longer living, and they had not the faintest idea if or where any evidence for the epicycles on epicycles could be found, unquote. Taken from Gingrich's book, The Book That Nobody Read, pages 56 to 57. In this part, Carter and Sarfati put up a list titled, quote, What We Have So Far, unquote, and the first thing listed under the title says, quote, Church Fathers supported heliocentrism, unquote. Normally we understand the Church Fathers to refer to the early Christians in the 1st through 7th centuries who wrote doctrinal treatises on the Christian faith, such as Irenaeus, Tertullian, Athanasius, Augustine, Jerome, etc. So, either Carter and Sarfati know this nomenclature and are deliberately confusing the issue by making it appear that these early Christians supported heliocentrism, or they are using the phrase, Church Fathers, in an unconventional way. Giving them the benefit of the doubt, it appears Carter and Sarfati are calling the few supporters of Copernicus, such as the Lutheran Joachim Rheticus, as Church Fathers, but this is quite a stretch. The supporters of Copernicus's solar system among those of high church ranking, whether Protestant or Catholic, can literally be numbered on one hand. Not only was Copernicus's book, De Revolutionibus, banned in the 1540s shortly after he published it posthumously in 1543, it was also rejected by Martin Luther, the highest-ranking Lutheran church member of the day, even though it would have been to Luther's advantage to accept Copernicus's book since it went against Catholic tradition. Although Lutherans such as Joachim Rheticus and Andreas Osiander were pro-Copernicus, they can hardly be considered church fathers, even in their own day. But while we are here, let's examine what both Protestants and Catholics have regarded as the original church fathers. Church fathers that even Martin Luther and John Calvin looked back to for theological and biblical guidance. Namely, those stalwarts of the faith that wrote early in Christian history, long before there were any divisions in Christendom. These fathers of the Church, who wrote from the 1st century to the 7th, were in absolute consensus that the universe is geocentric. Not one of them supported heliocentrism. Here is just a small sample of their writings. Athanasius, quote, "For the sun is carried round along with, and is contained in, the whole heaven, and can never go beyond his own orbit, while the moon and other stars testify to the assistance given them by the sun." Unquote. But the earth is not supported upon itself, but is set upon the realm of the waters, while this again is kept in its place, being bound fast at the center of the universe. Taken from his book, Against the Heathen, Part 1, number 27. Athenagoras, quote, "To him is for us to know who stretched out and vaulted the heavens, and fixed the earth in its place like a center." Unquote. Taken from his essay, Why the Christians Do Not Offer Sacrifices, Chapter 13. Augustine, quote, "The whole earth is suspended on nothing, for perhaps the world keeps its central place by the same law that attracts to its center all heavy bodies." Unquote. Taken from his treatise, The City of God, Book 13, Chapter 18. Basil, quote, "The earth occupies the center of the universe, do not then be surprised that the world never falls, it occupies the center of the universe, its natural place. By necessity, it is obliged to remain in its place." Unquote. Taken from his 9 homilies on the Hexameron, Homily 10. Chrysostom, quote, "Because they are unsteady and giddy, they think that the earth turns round with them, which yet turns not, but stands firm. The derangement is of their own state, not from any affection of the element." Unquote. Taken from his Homily on Titus, Section 3. Cyril of Jerusalem, quote, "The earth, which bears the same proportion to the heaven as the center to the whole circumference of a wheel." Unquote. Taken from his book, Catechetical Lectures, Section 6, Number 3. Gregory Nazianzus, quote, "And we are taught in the gospel of a third earthquake, namely, from this earth to that which cannot be shaken or moved." Unquote. Taken from his treatise, Orations, Book 5, Chapter 25. Gregory of Nyssa, quote, "The earth and the water, holding each other in, took the middle place of the universe, for neither is the earth shifted from its own base, nor does the heaven ever relax in its vehemence, or slacken its motion." Unquote. Taken from his essay, On the Making of Man, Chapter 30, Section 1, Paragraph 1. Gregory Thaumaturgos, quote, "That the earth itself continues stable, that the sun accomplishes its circuit about it perfectly, and rolls round to the same mark again." Unquote. Taken from his commentary on Ecclesiastes, Chapter 1, Section 2. Irenaeus, quote, "The sun also, who runs through his orbit in 12 months, and then returns to the same point in the circle." Unquote. Taken from his book, Against Heresies, Book 1, Chapter 17, Paragraph 1. All these church fathers said that the reason for their consensus was that the Bible taught geocentrism, not heliocentrism, and they accepted the history of the Bible as literal propositional truth. In fact, when Cardinal Bellarmine rejected Galileo's claims, the major evidence he used was that the church fathers were in consensus against heliocentrism, and all for geocentrism. He added that the 1563 Council of Trent said that whenever the church fathers were in consensus on a given doctrine, the church was required to follow them. To show that allegiance to the consensus of the church fathers in the interpretation of Scripture was not merely a disciplinary rule for exegetes, the same rule was reiterated at Vatican Council I in 1870, and thus clearly made a Catholic doctrine for all. It was also reiterated in several documents of Vatican Council II in 1965, including, De Verbum, Chapter 2, Paragraph 8 and Chapter 6, Paragraph 23. Also in Lumen Gentium, Chapter 8, Section 4, Paragraph 67. In Presbyterorum Ordinis, Chapter 3, Section 3, Paragraph 19. In Od Gentes, Chapter 3, Paragraph 22. And finally in Dignitatis Humanae, the introduction, Paragraph 10. According to Jesuit Father Giovanni Riccioli, the daily routine of the Jesuit colleges on the opening of the school year was to recite, as an oath, the Council of Trent's prescription on biblical interpretation. Dr. Carter's sign also displays a line saying, quote, "Christians supported Copernicus," unquote. This is at best a half-truth. A few years prior to when Copernicus decided to publish his book in 1543, there was only one Catholic cardinal who had given him support. And as we noted in the last section, the staunchest Protestant of the day, Martin Luther, harshly denounced Copernicus, as did Philip Melanchthon and the rest of Lutheranism, except of course, Kepler, Osiander, and Rheticus. On the Catholic side, in 1533, 10 years before Copernicus published De Revolutionibus, the personal secretary of Pope Clement VII, Johann Albrecht, gave a lecture on the heliocentric system to a chosen audience in the Vatican Gardens. Then, Paul III became Pope in 1534, and in 1535, Cardinal Nicholas von Schoenberg became interested in Copernicus and requested Theodoric of Radzin to copy all of Copernicus' writings and have them sent to Rome. He then wrote a private letter to Copernicus in 1536, saying, quote, "In it you maintain that the earth moves, that the sun occupies the lowest, and thus the central, place in the universe. I entreat you, most learned sir, unless I inconvenience you, to communicate this discovery of yours to scholars." Unquote. Whatever the real impetus for his interest, Schoenberg died the year after he wrote his 1536 letter, and Clement VII died the year after Albrecht's lectures. After this brief period, a much more ominous cloud came over the horizon for Copernicus. 6 years after Schoenberg's letter to Copernicus, in 1543, Bartolomeo Spina, the master of the Vatican's Sacred Palace until his death in 1547, sought to have Copernicus's book banned, which was eventually carried out by his colleague, Giovanni Maria Toleani, before his death in 1549. Similar to Copernicus's efforts to persuade Paul III, Toleani wrote a detailed geocentric treatise in 1546, 3 years after Copernicus published De Revolutionibus in 1543. Toleani dedicated his book to Pope Paul III, and it included an endorsement from Bartolomeo Spina, the master of the Sacred Palace who was in charge of allowing books to be published. In the book, Toleani vehemently rejected Copernicus's universe and declared it in extreme danger to the faith precisely because of its attempt to deliteralize sacred scripture and depart from the consensus of the Church Fathers. The work's title is, "On the highest immobile heaven and the lowest stable earth, and all other movable heavens, and intermediate elements." Tulzani insisted that Copernicus's teaching, quote, "could easily provoke discord between Catholic commentators on Holy Scripture, and those who have resolutely decided to follow this false opinion. It is in order to avoid such scandal that we have written this short work," unquote. As the 1500s reached the midway point, the staunchest anti-Copernican of the day was the Jesuit, Christoph Clavius. He writes in his highly esteemed work of 1570, Commentarius. Quote, "We conclude, then, in accordance with the common doctrine of the astronomers and the philosophers, that the earth lacks any local motion, either rectilinear or circular, and that the heavens themselves revolve continually around it. Holy Scripture is also in favor of this doctrine, stating in a great number of places that the earth is stationary. It also bears witness to the fact that the sun and the other heavenly bodies are in motion." Unquote. Finally, in 1620, Copernicus's book, De Revolutionibus, after being banned in the 1540s by the Catholic hierarchy, was placed on the index of forbidden books until, if and when, its errors were corrected.
Kepler, who says ellipses,
Very
and
important.
then we
yeah.
have Newton. What did Newton do?
Well, it's interesting that Kepler's ellipses proved to be far better at predicting than anything that had gone on before. That's why they were accepted, not because of any conspiracy against the Bible. Kepler was a devout Lutheran. You look at his devout writings all over the place. I mean, but he just realized he could predict things far better with elliptical orbits with the sun as a focus. So it's really a heliofocal system, not a heliocentric system.
Yes, for the heliocentrists, Kepler's elliptical orbits were far better than Copernicus's perfect circles. By the same token, however, Ptolemy's equant allowed his geocentric model to be more accurate than Copernicus's model insofar as the speeds of the planets in their orbits. In fact, it was Ptolemy's most ingenious invention, the equant, that allowed the planets to complete their orbits in the same time as Kepler's elliptical orbits. The problem with Ptolemy's model was not the timing of the orbits, but that he put Mercury and Venus in the wrong place, and thus the phases of Venus could not be seen from Earth. Still, Ptolemy left room for 6 variables in his system in case someone in the future would find the proper placement for Mercury and Venus. In the late 1500s, Tycho Brahe, the famous Denmark geocentrist, fixed that problem by putting Mercury and Venus around the Sun, and making the Sun go around the Earth. As for Kepler, he introduced elliptical orbits only after he had confiscated Tycho Brahe's 40 years of charting the planets and the stars. Brahe, who employed Kepler, wanted Kepler to use the charting to promote the geocentric system. But after Brahe died under mysterious circumstances, Kepler used the charting for the heliocentric system, which led him to elliptical orbits. But even then, elliptical orbits for the planets did not prove the heliocentric system, which was shown when, in 1665, Giovanni Riccioli applied elliptical orbits to Brahe's geocentric model, which demonstrated that the heliocentric system was no better than the geocentric in predicting the movements of the planets. In his day, the Jesuit, Father Giovanni Riccioli, was one of the greatest voices of the Catholic Church against the Copernican system. He was the sole author of the 2,500-page tome, Almagestum Novum, written in 1651. It stands as the most detailed and comprehensive defense of the Catholic Church's condemnation of Galileo.
Newton, his 3 laws of motion and law of gravity, found that the Kepler's laws would fall out of that.
Yes. So Newton says all objects in the universe are attracting every other object. And the amount of attraction depends upon the mass of the 2 objects and how far apart they are.
Yeah, inverse square law, yes.
And once you have that, you can take 2 objects in space and you can have them mutually rotate around one another. But the large one, like the sun, is not going to move very much because it's so large compared to something like the Earth. And once you have that, you have a gravitational attraction, you have a distance, you have a velocity, you can explain all the motions of all the objects in a solar system with no epicycles.
So it's really quite amazing. His laws of science were just revolutionary, the most important laws probably ever thought of.
Yeah, I say that Newton's law of gravity is the biggest engine of scientific prediction in human history.
Scientific prediction? How do you mean?
Well, we send a satellite out into space.
Mm-hmm.
We know exactly what it's going to do. We know exactly where it's going to go based on its velocity, how close it gets to Mars or Jupiter or whatever. We know beforehand We can calculate, okay, we have to do this, 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 and this, and this, and we can get this probe to arrive at Pluto. Even if you have to zing around Jupiter a couple of times to get it to go a little faster, you can predict all these things in the universe. Or how about this one? We have this wonderful dynamic model without a lot of ad hoc explanations. It's very simple. You start off with this very simple formula, and you can do lots of explaining of things. Like, see, my very educated mother just served. Those are the known planets. And then Uranus is discovered by observation. I think you told me it was Herschel that did that. And then we have this planet called Uranus. And we know it's far away from the sun, and we know it's orbiting very slowly. But it had gone about 3/4 of the way around its orbit before scientists realized that there were problems with the path that this planet was taking. After factoring in the gravitational attraction to Jupiter and Saturn, this planet, wait a minute, there's another planet. And someone wrote, the Berlin Observatory, an astronomer, he said, point your telescope right there in the sky. And they did that, and that night Neptune was discovered. So this scientific engine of predictability, they took planetary data and they used it to find an unknown planet, an invisible planet. You can't see it with the naked eye. It's not easy to find a faint planet way out on the edge of the solar system, but that's exactly what they did in this case because of Newton's laws.
So you couldn't have done it with Ptolemy because you find, okay, Uranus is its motion's a bit funny. Oh, let's put another epicycle on it to explain it. You would never predict Newton from that, but you could with Newton's laws. So that's why it's so important to have a dynamic model where you've got forces as opposed to a kinematic model where you're just describing motion. And if there's anything wrong with the motion, or just add some more descriptions to it. No prediction.
In actuality, Carter's and Sarfati's assertions about Newton's laws of motion are not completely true. As we noted earlier, even today, Newton's famous equation, F equals ma, will not get a space probe to go to its designated destination. To complete the needed trajectory, F equals ma requires the addition of the three inertial forces, the centrifugal, the Coriolis, and the Euler, to get a space probe to go where the engineers want it to go. The paradox is, in the Newtonian theory, the inertial forces are understood as fictitious forces, not real forces. And when the Newtonian engineers mustered the inertial forces into F equals ma to get the space probe to go to its selected destination, it is then that the engineers must consider the inertial forces as real forces, so that the final equation is F equals ma plus centrifugal plus Coriolis plus Euler forces. As noted earlier, physicists following general relativity consider this paradox a defect in Newtonian mechanics, as Einstein himself said. In the real world, either inertial forces are real or they are fictitious, but they can't be both. The second problem with Newtonian mechanics, as noted earlier, is that it must first assume space is absolute, that is, that it is fixed and doesn't move. But that stipulation requires a metaphysical presupposition, which is not allowed for empirical science. In fact, since Newton's law of universal gravitation held that all bodies in the universe gravitate toward one another, then at some point these bodies would all run into each other and coalesce into one body. Newton dealt with this problem by making the universe infinite. If it was infinite, he imagined, then it couldn't wrap itself up into a finite ball. If Newton's thesis held, then the consequence is true, that is, if the universe is infinite, then its space must be absolute and cannot move. Since space was absolute, then Newton could also claim that an object set in motion in the universe would travel in a straight line if no other forces were affecting its path. The inertia of the object would keep it moving ad infinitum, and one could measure the length of its linear motion because the space within which it traveled was absolute, and could therefore be measured between one Cartesian point and another. But if the space in which the object moves also moves, as, for example, in the curvature of space introduced by Einstein, then the object cannot be said to be moving in a straight line but in a geodesic or curved line. Another problem with Newtonian mechanics is that it has not been demonstrated to work outside our local environment. For example, spiral galaxies spin 10 times too fast than what F equals ma will allow. Hence modern Big Bang cosmology must add in the appropriate matter, which is called dark matter, so that the m of the equation F equals ma will be large enough to match the a. So, contrary to what Carter and Sarfati are proposing, Newton's mechanics are not the final or complete answer to why objects move as they do in space. There is something more, and this leads us to the geocentric system, which has all the needed ingredients and thus should replace Newtonian mechanics as the model for the universe. How the geocentric system works. The geocentric system incorporates concepts from Einstein's general relativity, Machian mechanics, and Newtonian physics. By the same token, it is to be understood that none of these three systems, by themselves, are able to explain how the universe operates. Whereas Newton held that the universe was infinite, fixed, and dynamically inert insofar as its relationship with Earth, the geocentric universe is finite, unfixed, and dynamically active in its relationship with Earth. More specifically, the universe is a sphere that rotates 360 degrees each day on its central axis, with the Earth as its center of mass. With its great mass, the rotating universe has great inertia or angular momentum, and thus it will spin ad infinitum at the same rate every day, without deviation. This steady rate of rotation is otherwise known as the law of the conservation of angular momentum. In principle, the larger the mass and/or the velocity, the larger is the angular momentum, and the more difficult it is to impede the rotation. And since there is no friction or other forces acting on the universe, there is nothing impeding its momentum, and thus it will remain the same ad infinitum. As such, the universe makes one complete revolution in 23 hours, 56 minutes and 4.09 seconds, which we know as the sidereal day. Conversely, although the rotating Earth of the heliocentric system certainly has angular momentum, there are forces that act on the Earth, both internally and externally, that can, and will, impede its rotation rate. Internally, such things as earthquakes, tsunami, volcanoes, tectonic shifts of land mass, and ocean currents, can impede the Earth's rotation. Externally, such things as planetary perturbations, tidal forces from the Sun and Moon, atmospheric drag, moon gravity drag, precessional inertial drag, outer space vacuum drag, frame dragging, asteroids, meteors, magnetic field variations, and cosmic radiation can affect the Earth's rotation. Evolutionists believe, for example, that millions of years ago the Earth's rotation rate was many times faster than it is now, which also implies it will become slower as the years roll on. Consequently, an Earth in rotation is not the most stable system for biological life, since even a small change in the rotation rate of Earth, caused by any combination of numerous internal and external forces, will affect the amount of heat that is absorbed from the Sun and thus wreak havoc on biological and other sensitive systems. Consequently, a rotating universe with an enormous angular momentum that cannot be stopped is the most stable system.